Not one, not two, not three, not four, but five. Five official visits for the Auburn Tigers this weekend. What it means and more. Let's go.
Well, Zach, I actually just finished crushing some chicken farm, and I am freaking ready to rock and roll.
You are Locked On Auburn, your daily podcast on the Auburn Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, welcome on into Locked On Auburn, your daily Auburn Tigers podcast. I'm your host, Zac Blackerby, and thank you so much for making Locked On Auburn your first listen every single day. It's Thursday. We're joined by John Garcia, Jr., Locked On Recruiting Insider, heads up all recruiting content with Sports Illustrated. John, busy weekend on the Plains. 5 OVs coming in. We talked about Bryan Harsin needing to see some momentum. Jamal Jarrett, the defensive lineman. Jaden Osberry, the linebacker. Ian Geffrard, the offensive tackle. Keyon Brown, the wide receiver. And then, of course, Brock Glenn, the quarterback we've talked about a ton. What kind of magnitude should Auburn fans kind of look at with this weekend?
This is huge. This is huge for Auburn. And all five of those guys are right in the middle of that SEC footprint, right? From Louisiana up to Tennessee, Georgia, Florida, all represented in just 5 individual official visitors. So that is a good kind of re-emphasis of, hey, like this is where we're going to pull talent from on a consistent basis. Interesting that there's no in-staters, so I think they're saving that for later in the game, which is smart because a lot of those in-state elites are taking their time. But some of these that are visiting are going to be a little bit closer to committing, particularly Brock Glenn. We all know you need to get your quarterback on board if you want to have a great recruiting class, and Glenn wants to be committed this month. So now that we're in June, the clock is really ticking for him. But I think it's a good group. It's a diverse group. And a couple of these guys, Glenn, Ausberry and Jarrett in particular, heavyweight battles with big-time schools across the SEC and beyond in most cases. So these are good timing visits as well, because for a lot of them, maybe outside of Jarrett, this is the first official visit. So this is the bar-setting visit of their recruitment period. So I think that's good for Auburn as well. Set the bar and be the tool that these guys go back and compare to when they're looking at their next couple of visits, and in some cases maybe right before a decision. So it's a good thing all around for Bryan Harsin this week. It's one of the bigger OV weekends that we're tracking going into the month of June. Yeah, so I mean, you mentioned Brock Glenn. We'll start with him. We like to start with quarterbacks here. The kid from Memphis, you mentioned SEC battle. It was Auburn, Missouri, and Mississippi State. Then it was Auburn and Mississippi State. And then A&M is kind of creeping their way in there as well. What does Auburn need to do to help kind of lay the groundwork for getting their quarterback of this class? Yeah, well, you look, Brock is kind of a different quarterback recruit relative to some of the things we see most kids talking about. Now, look, he does want to be developed, and he wants to go into a situation that is advantageous for him relatively soon, but he's not like, hey, I need to be the guy day one and because I can do all these things. So I do think that there's a little bit of patience with him that is good for what Auburn is trying to sell, especially with, this current quarterback battle left unsettled, a lot of uncertainty in the quarterback room going forward. So he's not one that's going to be as glued in on that as maybe some other quarterback recruits. So I think re-emphasizing the developmental aspect of what Auburn can bring and what Harsin in particular can bring will be big with Glenn. He already knows a lot about the Tigers. He already knows a lot about the program, his family. And his name's Auburn. His name is Auburn Brock Glenn, right? So you can't emphasize that enough.
Does that help, or do you think it hurts?
Yeah, it's a big deal. So I think in terms of the Plains in general, that stuff, that box is kind of checked already, right? He took an unofficial visit recently as well. So he knows the front end of it. It's about digging deeper to me with Brock Glenn, who is a kid that he wears his faith on his sleeve. So that's something that I'd be curious to see how Auburn utilizes, at least in terms of information and presentation wise, how deep that goes. And then he's a kid who wants to be developed. So I think really digging into the whiteboard, X's and O's, and the plan at Auburn, I think something like that is really paramount for a kid like this at quarterback relative to some of these other visitors where it's more maybe about creating an impression. Glenn's already got the impression. You got to hammer it home and go as deep as you can with this recruitment because he's as familiar with Auburn as any program that is recruiting him. So you already have that to your advantage. In addition to his name, you already have that to your advantage. I mean, it's an NIL deal just sitting there for him whenever he decides, if he ends up at AU, the deal's sitting there. But beyond that, how can you really sell the long-term play of living in Auburn, being a student there, developing on the field and off the field as well?
Right. John, let's now talk about another guy that you mentioned, Jaden Osberry. Seemed like he was already on campus earlier this week helping his brother move in. But, of course, the linebacker from Louisiana, specifically Baton Rouge, he's been to Auburn a ton. Was at Auburn earlier this week, but now we'll be on campus in the official visit capacity. What do you expect to change there?
Yeah, I'm kind of wondering if he just stayed
all week.
Did he just stay over there like, hey, let's hang out with big bro. And look, you have to start the conversation there, right? I mean, I think last year with that recruitment with Ausberry, the elder Ausberry, this was such a back and forth like LSU Auburn kind of feel. Right. And then once Auburn won out, you're like, well, what's LSU going to do with Jaden? And now they're not really under consideration to a high level. So he's going to leave the Baton Rouge footprint just like his big brother did. And of course, at Auburn, he's going to have now going forward that now that he's on campus, he's going to have as much insight as he could possibly want on what life as an Auburn Tiger football player could be like. So for me, the difference is now, okay, what about the football perspective and how it differs from big brother positionally, right? Because he's a linebacker versus his brother being in the secondary. And I think that's where it's going to be all about Christian Robinson. And I think, when we talk about individual recruiters in the SEC period, Robinson at linebacker, he's one of those guys that is going to keep the Tigers involved with the best linebackers on the board. And Osberry's been high on the board for 2+ years. I'm sure he was recruiting him when Robinson was at Florida, just like the Auburn coaches were recruiting him before they went to UCF, right? Gus Malzahn and company. So I do think that this is a longstanding understanding of what Auburn is. But I think particularly the time, or specifically, I should say, with Christian Robinson will be big for Jaden on this visit because there are some heavy-hitting defensive angles that he's going to experience the rest of the way in his recruitment with the schools that he's involved with. Notre Dame is starting to feel really good in this conversation because the word's kind of gotten out like, hey, LSU not really in it as much as maybe we thought they would be this time of year. So now everyone kind of feels like the door is truly open for this kid's recruitment. And this is one of the better linebackers in the country. So Robinson's ability to hammer that home one-on-one, I think will be big for Auburn. I will just say it that he will make a very good impression this weekend. And I think you might see some predictions starting to come in for Auburn relative to that Notre Dame buzz that we're starting to see from a national perspective. It could come down to those two. And you'd know better than me, Zach, who's the last recruit it's come down to Auburn or Notre Dame for? I can't remember one off the top of my head, but
I don't know.
It'd be all the more fascinating if that were the case.
Yeah, there's no question about it. John Garcia, our guest today, an offensive tackle taking an official visit this weekend. We'll get John's thoughts on Auburn's chances to pick up an offensive tackle. Boy, wouldn't that be nice? Today's show brought to you by Built Bar. Right now, they are rolling out different flavors of puffs. Built Bar puffs, they are delicious. They've got this marshmallowy goodness with protein mixed in there. They taste fantastic. It even says on the side, treat yourself to Built Bar puffs. It's easy. It's so easy. All you got to do is go to built.com, use promo code LOCKED15 to get 15% off your order. While you're there, you'll see all the different flavors that they have, and you'll see the macro breakdown of, man, these are all low in calories, high in protein, low in sugar. It's exactly what you want. So built.com, use promo code LOCKED15 to get 15% off your order. Use promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off. That is at built.com. John Garcia, an offensive tackle making an official visit. Music to Auburn fans' ears. I want to make sure I'm saying his name correctly. Ian, is it Geffrard?
That's how I say it.
Okay, then it's probably true. Yeah, three-star offensive tackle. You mentioned all the SEC states being involved. He is from Mableton, Georgia. What do we know about him?
Yeah, he's a guy who's been a bit of a late riser relative to some of the other linemen on the board for Auburn and some of these other schools. A guy who's, once his 2021 tapes started to circulate, started to pick up a lot more options. But Auburn was right there, right in the mix during that sort of rise for Ian. And he's a grunt, man. He's a wide-bodied offensive tackle type. He might be a guard down the line, depending on how his frame shakes out there in college, but he's got some swing potential, and that's any offensive tackle possibility is a big deal.
Yeah, 6'6", 350. You could kind of go either way depending on how you want to shape him.
It's going to depend. He's going to need to reshape and reassess, and I think that's something that he probably already knows and has an understanding of. So depending on how that goes, we'll say a lot about his position, because these pass rushers are getting a little bit smaller and quicker, so naturally a guy that big is a little bit harder to deal with. But look, he's really good at the point of attack, excellent run blocker, as you would imagine, with the size that he packs, and he's a Georgia kid, so it's an SEC ACC kind of deal for the programs that are involved with him. I do think, again, the positioning of this visit is big for Auburn, because he is one that looks like he's starting around third in terms of making a decision. He's getting closer to that point. North Carolina, a couple other schools are involved. And then there's this layer that's interested in him but hasn't gone all in. For instance, Georgia is not all in on him just yet. So, the timing of him wanting to be committed a little bit sooner, this is really good news for the Tigers, because if he was taking his time, then maybe that Georgia offer comes in September or October, and all of a sudden it flips everything on its head. It doesn't look like that's going to be the case here for Ian, so I think that's great news for Auburn. Easy sell here for the Tigers. They need offensive line help in just about every way, shape, and form. So I don't envision too much trouble from the coaching staff's perspective in terms of why he's an important recruit for them. And I think that priority level will be big in his recruitment, because there are teams that are interested but not, full pedal to the metal with him. So if Auburn is closer to that pedal to the metal, all gas kind of mentality, I think that emotional advantage could grow from Auburn's perspective here. So again, great timing for this visit, position of need, those boxes are checked. And I think when you start to pair official visitors with one another, you start to do them positionally to a degree. So when your potential future quarterback's on campus, and then there's an offensive lineman and maybe a receiver, now all of a sudden you start to talk amongst yourselves because you're all on campus together, and it starts to become this cumulative effect of camaraderie and almost team building before you're even committed to the program. So those things aren't by accident, and we've seen in the past those start to play big in recruiting. So I do think that is another thing that can't hurt the Tigers' chances here.
John, based on folks that you've talked to and just general assumption, do you think Auburn would take any offensive tackle that was like a high 3-star or better at this point? Or do you still think there would be a screening process?
I mean, there's always a screening process. I mean, look, you got the two big in-state offensive tackles. Those are, again, heavyweight battles there. Stanton, Ramil, Wilkin Formby. You got the kid down in my neck of the woods, Clay Whedon in Tampa, who you feel really good about there. So I think it's a tackle versus guard conversation. If Auburn is all in on him as a tackle, I do think the board could make it really interesting in terms of making that decision. But if there's
a limit, do you think there's a limit of how many tackles they would take?
Oh, I mean, they can't take 10, right? I mean, you want to take.
It'd be nice if they did, though.
Yeah, I know. Some Auburn fans are like, why not?
Why not? Right.
You got to take. There's a finite number you can take. I think it's usually 3, maybe 4. I don't want to say it's desperation mode, but you need volume as much as you need.
I would not hesitate at all if they took 4 or 5 offensive. I'm serious, John. I mean, especially with the way kids are transferring left and right. Like, I mean, they just need something at this position.
Right. Look, and I think if you're viewing him as a tackle, there's some other conversations to be had.
Yeah.
If you're viewing him as a guard and or a swing prospect, you can absolutely take him now. And I think today, if Ian's like, hey, screw the visit, I'm ready to commit right now, I do think Auburn would take him now. Yeah. If that's what we're getting at, I do think they take his commitment. Yes.
I hope so. You mentioned the wide receiver, a future wide receiver potentially being on campus. Keyon Brown, the 4-star wide receiver from Tallahassee, Florida, 6'3", 188, really good size for a rising senior. You got to love that. But seems like John, just as of last week, he picked up a ton of new offers. One of them being from Ole Miss, West Virginia, Troy, Marshall. Obviously, I think Ole Miss is the most appealing of all of those, but seems like this is a riser as well.
Definitely a riser, a kid we saw at the Under Armour Atlanta camp, and we're like, same thing you said. I'm like, wait, this kid's 6'3". He's running pretty polished routes. He runs well too. And I'm like, what in the world is happening here? And really, since then, everyone kind of has gotten the memo on Keyon Brown. FSU, of course, has long been in on him because he's right down the road at Rickards High School in the city of Tallahassee. But really, everyone's been waiting for, like, who's going to be the challenger to Florida State. And there's also a feeling where it's like, why hasn't he committed? If, he's a Tallahassee kid, he's long been a target that they've offered and courted. It's interesting that he's uncommitted at this point. He's looking to balance that out with other options. And now he sets this Auburn official on, like, here we go. That's going to be the school that begins to compete with Florida State for Keyon. And I think this would be a great situation for him. I don't think he's ever been to campus before, so this will be the opposite of what we talked about with Brock Glenn and Ausberry. This is like a true first impression, ground floor view of all things Auburn. We talked about good positional recruiters earlier too. I think Ike Hilliard is starting to gain some traction in that department. He can obviously sell everything he's accomplished himself as a player, which does give you some credence with recruits because you've been there and done that. But now as a coach and a developer, I think he could start to flex some more on the recruiting trail, and Brown would be a heck of a get. If you go into someone else's backyard, Auburn fans know this on both ends. You go into someone else's backyard, you get a kid from Baton Rouge or you lose a kid from Auburn, it hits differently. So if you go into Tallahassee and pull a Keyon Brown, it will hit differently in a positive way for Auburn. And again, it seems like Keon's been looking for that secondary school. So I'm curious now to see, of course, what the first impression is at Auburn, but also, does Ole Miss get a visit? Because they're the most recent offer, like you mentioned. Who else gets involved with him? I know Florida was talking to him for a little bit. Other schools have mentioned, building with him. Does he hit some camps and try to up his profile more? Or does he start to see Auburn and Ole Miss and FSU and say, hey, this is a good group to really lock in on and start to make a decision between those three? I tend to think it's going to be closer to the latter between the two. But again, people see 6'3", 180, and he's probably a little heavier than that now. And he runs well. He's productive. All these things that are positive. He plays basketball. We love that. Other schools are going to see that too. So is it about upping his own stock or really trying to find, the right school for him? And he's a quiet, a little bit reserved kind of kid. So I tend to think he's closer to the latter, where he just wants to start locking in on where he's going to play his college ball. So again, great timing for Auburn to create that first overall impression.
In just a moment, I'm going to get John's thoughts on the last official visitor coming to campus this week. And also, I'm going to put him on the spot. I'm sure he absolutely loves that right here on Locked On Auburn. I want to encourage folks to sign up and join the Locked On Auburn Discord, whether you're watching on YouTube or listening on audio. If you go to the show notes or the episode description, a link will be there. Also, a link will be there for auburndaily.com. That is Auburn Sports Illustrated coverage. Be sure to check that out. Putting up several articles a day about your Auburn Tigers. John Garcia, our guest today, the last guy coming in this weekend. Jamal Jarrett, 4-star defensive lineman from Greensboro, North Carolina. Great size, 6'6", 350. You mentioned an SEC, ACC battle for somebody else that we talked about a second ago, but it's happening here too. He's got crystal balls to Georgia. He's got crystal balls to North Carolina Where does Auburn fit in with this kid?
Yeah, it's funny. The same day we liked Keyon Brown, we started to like Jamal Jarrett at that Under Armour event in Atlanta. As you mentioned, North Carolina's got some traction here. He's from that state and has visited UNC, I think, double-digit times at this point. So there's certainly as much familiarity as one could have with one school he's got with UNC, and he's already taken the official there. So they're going to be in it until the end, whether it's them or somebody else. And then Georgia and Auburn are among the schools that this calendar year have really upped the ante for Jamal Jarrett. And look, he's a massive interior defensive lineman.
Sure.
Unfortunately for Auburn fans, he does give you some Jordan Davis vibes in terms of just how he's built. So I'm sure Georgia is going to sell that and hammer that home when they get their official visit in a couple weeks. Clemson's involved. This is a national battle more so than a regional one. But look, Auburn has been in the mix again, right around the time he started to rise. Auburn started to prioritize him, and he's felt that. We know Jimmy Brumba's done a really good job of keeping Auburn in the mix for defensive linemen, and he's an interior guy at heart too. So you understand that, that one-on-one with Jamal Jarrett will be good for the Tigers' chances to stay in the mix. Again, you're getting an official visit out of him in the middle of some others. So I do think that's important for the Tigers, again, to try to sell something specific to him. And again, if you look at the recent history of interior guys, Auburn can stack up with a lot of these teams in terms of what they've been able to do in terms of all SEC guys and even NFL guys on the defensive interior.
Eric Brown posters all over the facilities.
All over the place, right? And he's a guy you pulled from out of state, right? From the state of Georgia.
Right.
So I do think that, that can sell at as high a clip as one would perceive that Georgia or Clemson could sell him on. I think if you're from outside the region, you're like, oh, well, Auburn can't contend there. But I actually think they can, because they can stack up from a production standpoint relative to some of the others. So I think with these SEC schools in general, with Jarrett, it's going to be about presenting him something familiar because of that familiarity with North Carolina and how much he's spent time in Chapel Hill. I do think it's going to be an uphill battle for someone to pull him out of that. But right now it looks like Georgia and Auburn could be the two in the best position to do so. So the ball is certainly in Auburn's court ahead of this official visit. The timeline is up in the air. Last I saw with Jarrett, he could pop in the summer. He could wait a little bit. So with that uncertainty, it's good to have the certainty of an official visit, especially because he's only got a couple left to take. So the ball's in Auburn's court here. Not an easy recruit to win. Maybe the toughest battle of the five we've talked about, but certainly still a winnable one, which is, that's where you want to be.
Sure. John, in the Locked On Auburn Discord, there is a recruiting channel, and folks are constantly talking about guys, sharing tweets and all that stuff. And I always go to them and I'm like, hey, what do you want to hear John talk about? What should I ask him? And obviously the official visits this weekend was the big thing. But every week, I'm always hit up with, ask him who he thinks will commit next. And that is just such an open-ended question. It's impossible to answer that. But I will modify that question and ask it today. Of these 5 official visitors this weekend, who do you feel the most confident about Auburn landing?
Probably the guy named Auburn. I think Brock Glenn is maybe the biggest priority for Auburn in this class, and we know his timeline is accelerated. He told me face to face, I want to be committed before I go to the Elite 11. The Elite 11 starts June 28th, so we're 27 days away from there, and he wants to rep one school at that event. I do think Texas A&M is creeping up his list, but they're going to host 2 other quarterbacks with offers from A&M before the Elite 11. He doesn't have the offer yet. TCU, Virginia, Mississippi State, all involved. And I tend to think it goes back to the original group, right? Florida State just offered him as well. I think it goes back to Mississippi State versus Auburn, unless A&M pulls the trigger and goes all in on him, which I don't envision, because Jaden Rashada and Dante Moore are both taking visits mid-month, again, right before the Elite 11. So I think Brock Glenn to Auburn makes a lot of sense as long as they hammer the development home this weekend. But he will take all the trips, so don't expect the commitment this weekend. I think he will he's committed to taking those other visits, but I do think Auburn's going to be in strong position until this thing is over for Brock Glenn. And we know he's committing soon. So there you go.
John Garcia, thank you for your incredible insight as always. How can people follow you and find all of the content you're putting out?
Yeah, realsimple.si.com, realsimple.com. That's probably a website, but that's not mine.
There it is.
Mine is si.com/college, or check my name out on Twitter, which Zach so very fittingly put on the screen for you to see. So John Garcia _JR.
Absolutely. John Garcia, the best in the business, joining us. We'll be back tomorrow right here on Locked On Auburn.